why 1776? We know why, right? And why Eugene Debs saying Jefferson and Lincoln? Why? Well, I think only the working class believes in bourgeois values. The ruling class has abandoned bourgeois values a long time ago. Right?
Mhm.
And that goes for the capitalist class, it also goes for the intelligentsia. Right? It goes for the bourgeois intellectuals, the intellectual elite. A long time ago, right? I would say in Marx's own lifetime. The bourgeoisie and intellectuals and, surely politicians and statesmen abandoned bourgeois values. So where are the bourgeois values? Who believes in the bourgeois values? The workers.
All right, welcome, Civilization Media viewers. It's the Cutrone Zone with the last Marxist and genius, hat tip to Reed Kane, Chris Cutrone. Chris, you contacted me, and ahead of time. Usually, I have to reach out to you and say, "Hey, what are we going to talk about?" But you had a suggestion this time around that you wanted to talk about Javier Milei, the Brazilian. Argentinian president who was recently at Davos. Are you there?
Argentinian.
Yeah, Argentinian. Yeah, I said Brazilian, then corrected myself. So what was it about his lecture to the movers and shakers at Davos that you thought was worth commenting on as a Marxist?
I thought that his association of socialism with the state and his positive claims regarding capitalism and freedom, but also wealth, I thought were a good kind of entryway into problems in the self-conception of the socialist left today.
Right.
Can we meet his anti-socialism?
I saw a clip on a show called Due Dissidence. This is a couple of good guys who are trying to be critical of the Democratic Party and maintain a dissonant stance towards capitalism and the current social situation. But when they saw Milei's speech, where he was giving it to the people of Davos, they kind of seemed to misunderstand, from my perspective, what was going on, because what they said was something like, the right wing is saying that he's really giving it to the socialists at Davos, but he's really speaking to his own here. He's a neoliberal, they're neoliberals, they're all billionaires. He loves them as a Randian. He thinks they're the heroes of the world, of the age. So I don't see why anyone would think that he's out of his element here, or that he's particularly talking them down or trashing the people at Davos. They're all on the same team. What would you make of that kind of response?
Well, I mean, I think he pitches it that way, Milei. He basically says, you guys don't feel guilty about being the wealthy capitalists, right? Because it's your activity that's saving the world. And so don't allow yourselves to adopt a kind of guilty perspective with regard to what you do. You don't have anything to apologize for, right? That's the kind of criticism of the Davos people. He was saying you don't have to be socially responsible. You don't have to adopt any perspectives of social justice, because what you're doing is already socially justified and socially responsible. You are doing what society needs you to do.
Right. And so why did people on the right interpret him to be attacking the people at Davos, do you think?
Sure, because so the populist right would be unhappy with Davos and they'd be happy with Milei, telling them off, right? And because basically the idea is that the ruling class is selling out the people, and the way that they're doing so is by going along with this kind of state repression of the people, and that the ruling class is sort of imposing its will on the people. And in some ways, I guess the right populists are saying that the people are being made to pay for the guilty feelings of the ruling class.
The guilty feelings, or the crimes of the ruling class? I mean, because there's often a lot of charges of corruption or crony capitalism.
Sure.
That come along with that.
Right. But the idea is something like, yes, we ruined the world, we destroyed the environment, we created this climate change, but now we're going to make the working class give up its standard of living to pay for that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, you have to sort of, I watch Fox News, I know the sort of right populist mindset, right? And their attitude is that the ruling class is bad insofar as they're against the people.
Mm-hmm.
And the demonstration of that is, look at all the Great Reset, look at all these plans that they're concocting for the people to adopt a lower standard of living, that they're all going to be drinking Soylent and living in little cubicles and, dependent on, the wind and the sun, So when the winds die down and the sun goes behind the clouds, then the people just have to deal with a blackout. Whereas the ruling class will have their little personal nuclear power plants in their yachts and in their mansions. They'll be fine. Right? Mm-hmm. But the people will have to be these austere peasants. Right. Mm-hmm. Just because the rulers feel guilty, and the rulers have decided that, having a burger is bad. And so they're going to steal all the ground meat from the people. And they might just do that by making it so expensive at the grocery store. Right.
Right. So what do you think? So what is someone like, well, what do you think the solution is? First of all, do you think there's some truth to the idea that the policies being put together by the bankers and the people at Davos that might come under the heading of the Great Reset really are just about a guilty conscience? Is it just sort of an empty-minded anti-consumerism that they're grasping in an almost quasi-religious way? Or are they actually trying to address a real threat by demanding a certain level of redistribution and also austerity in order to make sure that the majority of people can survive, and that it's not a inhumane crisis?
Right. So, okay. So, we Marxists, right? We're like, oh, the ruling class, the capitalists, and oh, they're just profit driven and whatever. Well, no, these are people, right? And they're people are living at a certain time in history, and they want society to continue and humanity to continue and humanity to flourish. And they have their ideas about what that might be. And obviously, if the planet is rendered uninhabitable due to climate change, or if it causes millions or billions of people to be displaced, and especially poor people, that's going to be a horrible situation. It's going to make people suffer. It's going to be politically destabilizing, socially destabilizing, and so they're just thinking very technocratically. They're like, okay, what are we going to do, right? If the oceans rise, and if the temperatures increase, and if the polar ice caps melt, then we're going to be dealing with all these displaced peasants at our door, right? In the metropolitan world. And, yeah, we're going to have to let them in, and the workers are just going to have to accept it. But maybe we can, mitigate that. Maybe we can prevent that from happening. And maybe if people stop driving their F-150 pickup trucks, and stop doing donuts with their muscle cars, then, we might be able to prevent, the hordes of brown people from washing up on our shores. I mean, they're just thinking very practically and scientifically, right? And again, like technocratically. And, they're very aware of the fact that they can have an effect on policy. They can, they have access to the politicians insofar as the politicians are responsible and not these populist, demagogues who won't listen to them and who will mobilize the people against them and cause trouble. Right. I mean, they're just, from our perspective, I think what we have to say is they're just assuming the continuation of capitalism.
Right.
And that doesn't mean like profit margins, but it does mean like basically society as it is, what trajectory is it on and how do you manage that? And from our perspective, we would say, well, it's not going to be just like that, right? There are going to be economic and, technological upheavals that are unanticipated. History is going to throw a curveball at you, and capitalism is not going to be something that can be just sort of successfully managed in this way at any level, not at the level of like, money prices and capital flows, finance, credit and debt relations, right? Not at the level of like social practices, like on the ground, like what people do and how people vote with their feet, right? And do some things and not other things. That society is going to be more intractable than the state, than the bureaucracy, than the technocracy, than capitalist management, than these big capitalist corporations can get together and fix or handle. It's going to elude their control. And so again, to them, they're like, well, as long as we don't have any irresponsible politics, as long as we don't have any demagogical politicians riling up the people to do the wrong thing, then we can kind of handle this. We can fix this. As long as nobody interferes, everything's fine, right? Our point is, even if they could do that, it's not going to work out just as they think. Right. And, a lot of, the right, I guess in the neoliberal era, I mean, people of our generation, right, Doug? So I look at people like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, the people who would have been in the college Republicans when we were in college, right? These kind of nerdy guys who have grown up and are now like, big politicians. And unintended consequences. Remember that new right thing? Like, oh, the welfare state sounds nice, but what about the unintended consequences? What about the fact that it destroys the black family and at X, Y, and Z, right? And it's like, they have a point.
Oh, no, I totally down with that. Because right? I think Javier as someone who got, as someone who got into Marxism around the economic crisis, the idea of unintended consequences was big for me because it was like, okay, it kind of was a way of saying you can have massive profitability and a massive increase in your productive capacity and still go into an economic crisis. It doesn't take bad policy for that to happen. It could just be the unintended consequence of the way the system is set up. And that the same thing could happen on the level of the welfare state or affirmative action. These things can have the opposite effect than what they're intended to do. Yeah. Right.
And so, I think that people have gotten sick of that kind of Reaganite or Thatcherite kind of mantra. And so they're just like, no, we have to try to do something. Right. So like, again, Javier Milei, like he's just one of these guys. He's like, he's our age, literally. He's literally our age. And I feel like he was educated through the same kind of ideological, cultural universe. Although in Argentina, you have the Peronists, right? And then you have, so you have this kind of history of like socialism that's kind of a little bit fascistic, a little bit like Madonna did her stint, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, right? As Eva Perón. And so, it's kind of like, well, has that worked out? And Argentina's been in crisis. And he's just saying, look, the socialism just hasn't worked out. And how much more evidence do we need of that? And we don't need like a refurbished version of it. And we don't need it coming from like well-intentioned rich people, right? The rich capitalist elites should just do what they do. They should just try to make, I think he says, try to make a good product for a good price, and make a profit. And in the end, it will benefit us all. I mean, his historical view is interesting because, he has a kind of curious notion that human standard of living, wealth, was static for thousands of years, and then it only takes off with the Industrial Revolution in 1800. And I'm like, well, that's not quite right, actually, right? So Adam Smith, writing The Wealth of Nations, publishing it in 1776, observes the fact that there actually has been an appreciable increase in the standard of living of the working class for the previous couple of hundred years. And he also sees that that's the case in the northern North American colonies, right? That they have a higher standard of living actually than the working class in Britain does at the time. And that's due to, again, a more free kind of bourgeois social relations operating. And so, but it is curious that Milei kind of points rather to the Industrial Revolution as the key to that. And, he has some basis. I mean, there's statistical evidence for that. And also that it's increased since then. In other words, that the growth rate has only gone up since then and even increased at a faster rate. And he points to something that I know that I pointed out to you in one of our conversations months ago now about the period from like 1980 to 2008 being the largest, deepest increase in wealth ever in history. Right. The Davos people would say, this is the period of the greatest decrease in poverty that the world has ever seen.
And a lot of that's down to China, right?
A lot of it's down to China. In other words, skews the statistics globally. In other words, because of China, it raises the statistics globally. But it's more than that. It's also Africa. It's also India. And so, it's the Green Revolution, not meaning ecology, environmentalism, but literally new agricultural technology. Right. So agricultural productivity has increased a great deal. And, it's just become cheaper and more efficient to produce a lot more food than it was. And so that's gotten rid of basically famines. The only famines that have existed for political reasons, like war, since the 80s. So, but that's purely technological. And of course, there's a downside to that. And of course, it's eaten into, the right-wing people made a big deal of the Native American woman from an Amazonian tribe, like blessing the people at Davos. Through some strange ritual. They were like, oh, look at how weird the rich Davos people are. They do this strange Native American ritual. And I'm like, yeah, it's not that strange. She's blessing them for saving her rainforest, basically. She's saying, thank you. You're fighting to save my rainforest. Because, that's what the agricultural revolution has looked like, the Green Revolution. It's looked like the destruction of the rainforest for farming in a place like Brazil. Right. So there's been a downside to the Green Revolution for sure, environmentally. I think we forget about that the destruction of the rainforest is part of the mix because that's the big scrubber of carbon dioxide, right? Is the plants, and the intense vegetation of the rainforest, as that's what scrubs the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so if we get rid of that while we keep pumping out CO2 through burning fossil fuels, then right, we get this imbalance. And so again, it's kind of like you could look at it technically. I mean, I actually think that capitalism will solve the climate crisis. I do. And so I don't think that we need socialism to save the planet. No, the capitalism is going to do that. But again, at what cost? And I think that the right, is mobilizing this fear that part of the cost is going to be the destruction of the standard of living of the working class. Right, in the metropolitan countries especially, but really kind of everywhere. And I think that that's warranted, and I do think that the Davos people, but also people like DSAers, like AOC, having children is selfish. Right, there's a degrowth perspective. There is a degrowth perspective, and that means degrowth in population, and it also means degrowth in consumption. Right, and they're going to take our cars away. They're going to get rid of our autonomy and our mobility. They're going to lock us in these cities. I mean, the Great Reset, COVID. The idea that like, oh, look at how good for the environment COVID was. If we just lock down the population, that will save the environment. And what it really means is if only people could adopt the lower consumption habits of the COVID lockdown era. That would do the trick, right? So how do we institutionalize this? And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's not paranoia. I mean, literally, people did say that. They did. They are like, this is a model for what needs to happen.
I recall I think it was the late 90s, listening to a lecture on tape, but it may have been like found it online. I'm not sure, but so it may have been later. But of Noam Chomsky discussing the prospects for freedom in the future. And he pointed to climate change as one of the great threats for personal freedom.
Oh yeah, good.
But the way what he
I'm
said
sure he's
was,
forgotten that now.
No. But what he said at the time was, if we don't do something, make the Republicans do something, and I think it may have been, or the Clintons. It was either like the Democrats or the Republicans, one of Clinton or Bush. Do something, we may reach a point where we will have to accept authoritarian rule just in order to survive. We will have to accept, drastic austerity measures just in order to survive. That was what he said. So we need to.
Yeah, what's surviving?
Well, I that's a good question.
Soil and green.
Reproducing the population. Reproducing the population. I think would be.
Euthanasia.
It's funny that have you ever had Soylent, by the way?
I have not. There are lines that I draw.
I have
a lot of millennial things, but not that.
I did it. I have a few. There was a time where I thought, well, I've struggled with my weight, so I thought, well, if I had
was going to say keto weight loss.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'll just regulate exactly how many calories I'm getting, because I'll just drink this drink and that's all I'll do. And then I just found after a while, I would end up binging real food at the end. It was not good. It was not a great.
Your body doesn't like that anywhere.
Right. Anyway, maybe I'll cut that part out. But
you're on the West Coast though, so people are into all these like detox rituals. They like purging themselves.
We like all sorts of crazy things. But I want to say, like, the left that I remember, and probably the left as it is today, although today everything's a little fragmented and crazy, but would find your claim that capitalism can solve the climate crisis, that we could have a technological fix, to be barbaric and deeply reactionary and quasi-fascist, because obviously we cannot simply continue to let capitalism run amok and destroy the planet. And you're advocating for the capitalist class when you say that kind of propaganda. I'm just channeling my Adbusters 1995 self. So how would you respond to that allegation? Because I know we're going to get it.
Right. I feel like the capitalist class, like I get the heebie-jeebies whenever class is raised because I'm like, yeah, no. Like I hate talking about class because I just am working class. And so I feel like the people who hate the capitalist class are just the petty bourgeoisie who resent the fact that they're not in charge and that there are people wealthier than them. Whereas I feel like, okay, I'm just going to have to deal with whatever new standard of living my betters decide we have to live by. Right, like I'm just a worker, and so I'm just gonna do whatever. I'm gonna live on whatever. I'm gonna buy the latest thing that they say I should use to survive. I'm gonna have to accept the wages that that they feel like they can afford. That's just life. I'm a peasant ultimately. The gods will decide everything, and so but I don't think that that's the problem, really, right? And I think that this is where, Milei's point comes in, right? Which is that it's not out of the altruistic intentions of the capitalists that society is free and that people's lives are improved, right?
Right.
So, and in fact, when you're depending on that, then you're sacrificing freedom, but in a kind of spurious way, meaning that it's not like you can trade. It's if you trade freedom for security, you get neither. Right, and just this basic libertarian stuff. And I know that we're supposed to all be done with all this post neoliberalism. We're supposed to burn Ayn Rand's books or something, and forget Milton Friedman or what have you. And I kind of feel like, well, but wait a second. And what I was going to say about like capitalism solving its problem through authoritarian austerity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that we're going to have to accept some barbarism. That already happened. I always like to say the end of the world already happened. The destruction of the environment, that's behind us. It's over. Like that ship has sailed a long time ago. It's done. Now, post World War II, high consumption capitalism was barbarism. And the working class basically was forced to accept higher consumption to save capitalism. You could look at it that way.
Yeah.
You could say they traded like the slum tenement working class community in the city for social atomization and existential death in the suburbs.
Existential death?
Yeah.
What do you mean? You mean
spiritual meaninglessness?
Spiritual. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, existential, like what's the meaning of life? Revolutionary Road, the movie,
Yeah. I don't think that the work, I don't know. Do you think that was a working class problem? I remember all the anti-consumerist, anti-suburbs movies and books and TV shows and
we always see it through the so-called middle class, but it's the working class. I mean, again, I am working class. My parents were born in Brooklyn, and their parents moved them out to the suburbs. As working class, they were union workers, 9 to 5, union workers, literally like factory workers, like construction workers. I had all 4 grandparents worked. The women worked. They were unionized secretaries. They worked.
Right.
One grandfather was like a worker, like an electrician for a military contractor. The other was a construction worker for the municipality. Like, he did the roads and things like that, paved the roads. So they are working class people, and they had a wage that allowed them to buy a house in the suburbs and a small house. And, they considered that to be a better life than what they could have had in Brooklyn. They were, but I don't know. Like, in other words, when I look at my parents, and the baby boomer generation, my parents' generation, as opposed to my grandparents, who were the World War II generation, I just think, well, is this a better life for them? Did they give their children a better life than they had as children growing up? right? In other words, the working class community that they were in Brooklyn in the 30s, the Great Depression, right? How bad was it? Was it bad? And, the dysfunctionality of my family, the dysfunctionality of a whole generation of families, of working class families, would that have been mitigated at all by living in a more like extended family, tight working class community milieu, rather than all being like, disintegrated into suburban households and everyone living their own private family, nuclear family meltdown drama, each in their own house, as opposed to, upstairs, downstairs, across the hall in the tenement building, in the apartment building, right? I'm just saying, because, I won't forget, I can't forget the fact that people living under those conditions were, also wanted things like socialism, like working class people at that time were much more organized for socialism than they became in the 50s and 60s and in our lifetime. And, and I just think, okay, this trade-off, right? Was it a good thing? Is this progress? I'm a Frankfurt person. I don't think it's progress. I don't. I mean, I'm not anti-consumerist. I don't like the whole 60s anti-consumerism, and I certainly don't like our generation's anti-consumerism, because I feel like our generation was an austerity generation. In other words, we did have to adopt a lower standard of living than our parents. And what we were going to celebrate that as like anti-consumerism? It's like, fuck you.
Right. That's one thing that the millennials and the Zoomers don't understand about Gen X is what we got here first, as far as having lowered expectations, and we had that's right. Our whole generation was defined around being worse off than our parents. That was the big thing about being Gen X. But as to the trade-off, when you say it was a trade-off, I mean, how did it work? Didn't it work basically like the conditions in the cities became so dire that people would move out, or was that what happened, or was it that the suburbs were cheap and they could afford it and have a higher standard of living by moving out? Which way, or both? Which way did
I would say it's both. I mean, of course, it's not exactly. I mean, it was masterminded to a certain degree. Yeah. It also wasn't masterminded, right? And then we know from like redlining, we know discriminatory practices in terms of like credit lines offered for mortgages. Like, how was it affordable? In other words, I always like to say, okay, people became, because the left will say, oh, the working class was depoliticized by becoming property owners, and this is the model. And I'm like, but did they own property? No, they owned debt. Right. And so it's not like they became property owners. I mean, maybe they did think of themselves as property owners and as stakeholders in that sense, kind of avant la lettre neoliberalism. But I feel like, well, surely though, so they were like, well, yeah, it's like building equity. So we have this thing, equity. So the difference between renting and owning is, rent, you're just paying rent, and owning, you're paying a mortgage, but at least you're building equity. Right? That whole notion. And of course,
no, it's a big deal. That was like a mantra.
It's become important now for our generation, because now that our parents paid off their homes, we can inherit their homes as retirement funds, because we were not able to save for our retirement because of our lower wages than they were. Right. So they were able to pay off mortgages and have a retirement fund in a way that we don't. And so thank God they have equity in their property, because otherwise we would be on the street as senior citizens. Right. And so again, I just feel like if you look at the dynamics of history and you look at like capitalism can be all sorts of things. It can be high consumption. It can be low consumption. It can be all sorts of things. And so, and capitalist barbarism can be those things, those different things, right? So we have a picture in our mind, and also the left has a kind of narrative that I always feel like, let's think again about that. Like that narrative, no, I'm not sure about that.
Mhm.
Like, is this what happened? Was the working class bought off? Were they sent out to the suburbs to become property owners? Were they atomized? I mean, I was leaning in that direction earlier in what I was saying. Were they disorganized because they were atomized as consumers in the suburbs? Sure, yes. But also, so what are we supposed to do? We're all supposed to move from the suburbs back to the city, and then we're going to have some socialist utopia because we're going to get organized.
Do what the
DSA.
people at Davos do, Chris. Do what they do. Move to Park Slope, buy yourself a $15 million townhouse, take up a couple of lovers and be part of a polyamorous throuple, write a memoir about how much hell that was, and make another $1 million or two or three.
Right. But again, I think
that's my petty bourgeois side right now.
Well, that's your resentment for the more successful petty bourgeoisie, right? In other words, you're thinking of the book contract that you never got, a book contract that would have actually paid, right? But I'm thinking, okay, well, what is the DSA's program for the working class? Right? I think that they are for re-urbanization, and that means shrinking the carbon footprint, right? Maybe you let the suburbs get overgrown with weeds so that you reduce the amount of cement and asphalt, right? Which is a big, contributor to climate destruction and global warming even, right? And so I just think, okay, all sorts of cockamamie ideas have been floated in our lifetime regarding like environmental catastrophe. It's been there since we were kids.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like I am sympathetic to the right. The right is like, these climate maniacs have been declaring the end of the world for the last 50 years, and it hasn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's like, but this time it's for real. It's like, no. Right. So the right-wing populists are like, no, this is all just what they want to use to scare us into submitting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they're thinking even though right-wing populism, right, it's not about the working class. It's about the middle class, right? In other words, they're saying PMC, don't go with that like progressive liberal Democrat Davos scene. Go with us instead, right? That's what they're making the pitch to the PMC. They're not, the working class. Nobody cares about the working class.
Sohrab Omari seems to care about the working class. You talked to him in New York at Columbia. He's pitching to at least the existing institutions of labor. Maybe
they hate Milei over at Compact, by the way. They really hate Milei over at Compact. And of course they would. And I feel like, but still the working class is some kind of object. It's not a subject. It's an object. Meaning, like, Sohrab thinks that the workers would be better off unionized, because a unionized working class would be able to push its demands and you get better policy. Right? He's still thinking very technocratically. He's like, how do you make policy changes? Well, you need a pressure group. And it seems like for the right policies, you need the right pressure group, and the right pressure group is organized labor.
Right.
Very technocratic.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the DSA. I mean, that is so. But he's been Biden.
And he does that though out of the desire to strengthen the family and to have a more harmonious
Sure,
life.
The workers would be better off if they lived in families. Well, guess what? He's a refugee from the Islamic Republic of Iran. The mullahs in Iran also think it's better for the working class to live in traditional families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they have a political solution for how do you achieve that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you could have Islamofascism, you could have, Catholic fascism, like it's like, you could have religion, right? And that's probably the easiest way. I mean, the old socialist perspective on religion is that religion is the way that the capitalists get the workers to accept discipline.
Mm-hmm. So what did you think of, maybe I'm changing the topic and I shouldn't, but maybe I'll save this for the parrot room. because I feel like you have more to say about how we should relate to the neoliberalism or the Randian perspective of Milei. So, how should a Marxist understand this moment where the great capitalists of the world are gathering together to try to implement policy that Milei didn't come right out and call socialism? Maybe he did, but that
he did. Yeah. And
right.
he might have even called it Marxism.
Right. So the great billionaires are implementing Marxism, and most of the left, the dissidents are saying, oh, they are not socialists. They're too rich to be socialists. They're too powerful to be socialists. They're still money grubbers and profiteers at base. Okay. But what you're saying is, well, what we think of as socialism is actually capitalism. And it isn't, and not everything that's capitalism is done strictly for economic reasons.
Right? Well, right. And or at least not for profit motive reasons. It's not as simple as that. I mean, okay, so me watching the Milei, I'm not particularly sympathetic to him. In other words, I thought, okay, here's another right-wing guy who wins an election and the right gets excited about it. But then some rightists are not too excited about it because it seems more like, this old style libertarian capitalism, anarcho-capitalism kind of neoliberal kind of thing. I'm sure Tucker Carlson's probably not too happy with Milei. I'm sure Tucker Carlson prefers like Bolsonaro and Viktor Orban and those kinds of people rather than Javier Milei. And so, but I kind of feel like, okay,
who would you rather?
I don't really. Well, I prefer Milei, of course. But
me too.
I have to check myself because I'm like, okay, does that mean that I'm in the end sort of nostalgic for a kind of neoliberal conversation or something? The terms of a kind of neoliberal framework. Now, I just felt very simply like if I were in Davos, if I were in Switzerland, if I was hanging out, if I was at the cocktail parties, right? And I'm like, hi, Chris Cutrone, I'm the last Marxist. Maybe you saw my book published by Sublation. We got a table over there in case you're interested, right?
We should do that. We should definitely table Davos. That would be awesome.
Right? Don't you think? Right? I get Norman Finkelstein to make an appearance.
That would be awesome.
Get Jack Ross to make an appearance next year.
Oh man, he's having a
meltdown. He would give them a run for their money if he cornered any of the like John Kerry, and start having a conversation. They could go for hours. But I feel like who would I talk to at the cocktail party more productively? Who would I be more likely to convince of Marxism? Javier Milei.
Probably, yeah. I mean, it's not going to be easy no matter who you're talking to, but he would have you could at least find points of agreement a little more quickly.
More easily. I could just say, look, Marxists aren't against like capitalist growth and wealth. No, right. The point is that do we have to pay the price of these recurrent crises and periodic self-destruction of capitalism? Is that the price of freedom, or is it not? Right? Do we not have to pay that price to be free? Actually, right? And freedom is the point, and surely wealth, is the key to freedom. Absolutely. I mean, that's where he agrees with the DSA. Like a Ben Burgess would say, well, the freedom means like workers having enough wealth to have autonomy in their lives. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That would be the Javier Milei desideratum as well. And, but again, that I would just say, look, that's not the point from a Marxist perspective. I mean, I would sort of say to him, look, I get what you're saying about socialism. I get it. Like most people who call themselves socialists are just authoritarian statists and they don't believe in freedom. I agree. You're right about that. Totally. Right? They need to be stopped. I agree. And by comparison, yes, capitalist technological innovation, let it rip. Absolutely. Right? And, you know, freedom, damn it, right? The way he ended his speech, like, long live freedom, damn it, which probably sounds a lot better in Spanish than it did in English translation. It's probably much, you know, flowed better. And I'm like, absolutely, I totally agree. But how? And also, what about these problems? And is it really just like market correction? You know, is it just mistakes? Is that what we're talking about? You know, aren't there structural problems in the economy? And again, that doesn't mean the state's going to come in and solve it. It doesn't, right? But it does mean, look, that you can't deny that there is this problem. And is it going to work itself out in the end if we just like free things up more, if we just have a freer market? You know, probably not. You know, I mean, it's hard for us to point to evidence because the state has managed capitalism for the last 100 years, at least. Right. And so that's where it would become impervious.
Yeah, but you can point to the 19th century crises that happened. You know?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
When there was far less control. Absolutely.
Right.
And so, you know, it's kind of like, look, this anarcho-capitalist, like libertarian utopia, fine. And maybe he is saying, like, look, maybe we'll never get that, but those are the values we should pursue. That's what should inform our judgment. You know, I kind of get it. But again, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to have to convince him that he's just accepting capitalism, but I'd have to convince him that he's accepting all the downsides of capitalism necessarily. And that really, it's just a rationalization to say, oh, well, that's freedom. That's the price you pay for freedom.
Right.
You know, no, I don't think so. Right. But again, I'm sure that he's someone who doesn't like war. I'm sure he thinks wars are caused by like crony capitalists, like, you know, with their corrupt, you know, contracts with the state. I'm sure he believes all that, you know, that all the ills of the world from the state. And there's some truth to that. There is some truth to that. But again, like social conditions, in other words, what makes that possible? What makes those things possible? It's not just bad policy or state power usurpation and corruption. It's not just that, right? And that's the harder sell. That is the harder sell. But again, just to say, look, you know, I mean, again, could you in a half an hour explain like Marx's value theory? I think you can. I actually think you can. You could say, look, crises of value, like this is what happens, you know?
Yeah.
You get a crisis between the value of wages and technological production. Right?
Right.
And that goes beyond a market correction.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I think that you can make a plausible case. You know, I think I've told you this in the past. I'm for like the easy button, you know, like the Staples commercial where the people at the office are having some conundrum and then the Staples person comes in with the big red button, the easy button. I'm for the easy button when it comes to like understanding Marxism and this kind of stuff. I'm like, no, just take the easy button. You know, don't overcomplicate it. Like, yeah, I know that history is a thicket of conundrums, but there are some basic things that are actually pretty easy to get across. Now, how, in terms of solving it, no, there's no easy solution there. But again, you know, if it's about like the people having more control over their lives and, you know, the best social and political conditions for doing so, then Marxism agrees that liberal, like, you know, freedom in society, in everyday life, is like not only the way, but is like a value in and of itself.
Am I remembering correctly that Rosa Luxemburg critiqued imperialism on the basis that it was a form of monopoly capitalism that dysregulated the market? And and that was bad for workers and capitalists both, that there wouldn't be the same kind of innovation because of the monopoly power of the imperial countries, and that it was holding back capital's development and with it the development of the working class power. Is that basically what she
Yes.
said? Yeah. Yeah. And so it's worth noting that she sounds like a anarcho-capitalist to our ears,
Right.
maybe, and right.
Right.
And you have to think like, okay, why would she say that? What's going on?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I try to keep reminding myself is that being a Marxist means first, not just assuming that I already know what the right answer is to a social problem, and that and it certainly means giving up on the idea that what's holding back a solution are some bad guys over here in Team Red or Team Blue or in some bank
Mm-hmm.
somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about. I'm going to ask you before, and I'll ask you now, and then maybe we can talk more about it in the parrot room because we're coming up on an hour. But you saw the Jack Ross interview / video essay that we put out. He's got his book, The Strange Death of American Exceptionalism, coming. What did you make of his view of the historical causes for the successor ideology, or the sort of puritanical Davos type, call it intersectional or call it just puritanical moment that we're in? What did you think of his ethno-religious story that he told?
Well, so I haven't read the book yet because it's not out yet. So I only got this kind of summary version of it, and so I don't have the full contours of the argument. But I think that Jack Ross is someone who is, like, I guess, culturally conservative in a particular way, right? In other words, that he's like an old style socialist, like really old style socialist, in this sense that capitalism is this bad kind of cultural homogenization. It's sort of antithetical to culture. It's antithetical to culture in the working class, and replaces like a real culture with like consumer goods. Right, and that's obviously part of the problem with a kind of PMC, kind of technocratic kind of approach to managing capitalism, is that it sort of exacerbates that problem, right? It kind of compounds it. So we have to acknowledge that. And I do think that, it's kind of like, I'm always reminded, I mentioned this with Sora Bamari at the event that we had last summer in New York, the Danielle Bell, a socialist in economics, a conservative in culture, and a liberal in politics. And that sounds like a great solution, doesn't it? Right? In other words, it sounds like, we want political freedom, we want political liberty, right? We want the Bill of Rights. We want, a liberal political order. We want like the Bill of Rights, maybe even the Constitution, the checks and balances. We want liberalism like that. We want multi-parties. We don't want a party state, totalitarianism, or even a soft version of that, which you get with the New Deal Democrats, and who still dominate politics in the United States and have ever since 1934. Because our generation, I think that our generation and then the millennials growing up under Bush in their first moment, and then with Trump coming back, I think they have this idea that, like, I don't know, the Republicans are the dominant party in the United States, or something. And it's like, no, obviously the Democrats are the dominant party in the United States, and they have been for a very long time. And they govern the vast majority of the population. If you look at municipal politics, I think that they govern like 80% of the population directly. And so, it's, and we should be thankful if there's any opposition at all, right? In other words, like, yeah, the opposition is not great. The Republicans are not great. Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio are some kind of like Reaganite college Republican creatures, but I'm kind of glad that they're there to like ask a question, and like, like, because otherwise, like, everyone's just going to be patting each other on the back and saying how great everything is, right? And how we're always doing the intelligent best thing all the time, aren't we?
Right? What do you make of the fact that people say that Biden's presidency, is like LBJ's, and that he is being ruined by his foreign policy, his wars, but otherwise he would be an extremely popular president because of his.
That's the other Jack Ross. That's the other Jack Ross dimension, which is that he's very anti-neocon. He's very anti-neocon. So he's anti-neoliberal and anti-neocon. And I feel like the article that you guys published in the Sublation magazine, really starts there, right? It starts with like Tony Jett, right? It starts with the crisis of neoconservatism that the War on Terror revealed. Right. So the War on Terror was the bankruptcy of neoconservatism. And then the idea is that the neoconservatives have migrated over to the Democratic Party now.
No, I think that's both true, right? Those things are true.
Yeah, those are true. Those are absolutely true. And so two major elements are neoconservatism, neoliberalism, both went into crisis. War on Terror, Great Recession. Well, that leaves the Christian right standing. Right? And kind of standing, teetering, like Karl Rove and George W. Bush were like yucking it up. They're like, yeah, these Christian fundamentalists, we can count on their vote. We only have to pay lip service. We don't have to actually do anything. Right? And surely Trump agrees with that all he has to do is pay lip service.
Well, he did more than that, accidentally.
Accidentally, though, right? And then he's like regretful. Right. Although now he will own it. He will say, well, I gave you overthrowing Roe versus Wade, and don't squander it by being too extreme. Right. Make sure that you paint your opponents as the extreme. And yes, we might have to accept abortion, because for political reasons, because you have to get votes. Right. And so I think that that's preferable to something leaking out of private conversations in the White House. I think it's preferable to have a politician just say somebody has to represent the anti-abortion position. It is a large constituency, but it's at a bargaining table, and the anti-abortion people have to give up some things too. Right? So like, isn't that like just rational at some level? And yes, I mean, I am a liberal on these things. I do think abortion rights, that people, it should not really be. The state should not. I do believe in that. But the political reality of capitalist politics is you're going to throw some, nominal regulations. In other words, how many people get abortions after 15 weeks? Very few. And so partial birth abortion and all this stuff, it's just such a small phenomenon that, like, obviously it's demagogued. Obviously it's whatever, right? And so, but do you need like a law to regulate that? No.
Yeah, but the neocons moved to the Democratic Party, and the neoliberalism went into crisis as well. That's just to go back, Jack. That's Jack Ross's starting point. You were saying, not. Yes. I just don't want to get diverted down onto.
And that's the millennial left's starting point. I mean, he is a quintessential millennial leftist that way, absolutely. And it's good that he's not losing sight of the neocon element, right? But to get back to it, then, in terms of Biden, I mean, look, from our many conversations that last fall on the Gaza war, that I refuse to adopt a simplistic characterization of the Biden administration. In other words, I don't think the U.S. government in general, nor do I think the Biden administration in particular, are simply pro-Israel. They're not. Right. In other words, they're not happy with Netanyahu, with his policies. They're not happy with aggressive settling on the West Bank. They're not happy with the conduct of the Gaza war. They clearly are not. Like, they obviously are not. And I'm a watcher of Fox News, so I see all the right-wing people saying how Biden is selling out Israel. They are less wrong than the left saying that Biden is just providing ideological cover for genocide. In other words, the left saying that Biden is providing, is doing token criticism of Israel to provide ideological cover for genocide. That is completely wrong. And when the right says that Biden is selling out Israel, it's partially wrong. Right? And so, again, I just feel like, I don't believe that Biden's being done in on right-wing foreign policy. I don't. I mean, obviously, that's a certain kind of narcissism of the millennials and the Zoomers who think that they're very important. I don't think that this election will be decided out of youth disaffection for Biden over Palestine. I do not.
I've heard an argument that they will be consequential. Do you want to hear what it is? It's from Robert Wright.
Oh, really?
And,
okay.
Yeah.
Blast from the past. Labor Secretary of Bill Clinton.
No. Robert Wright, former editor at the New Republic.
Oh, no, Robin Wright, you mean. I misheard you. I thought you said Robert Wright. You said Robin Wright.
Wright, not Robert Wright. Not.
Is it Robin Wright?
No,
Robin?
I think it's Robert Wright. He's Robert Wright.
Oh, okay.
He's a former head of Blogging Heads, former editor in chief of the New Republic. Friends with Mickey Kaus. Mickey Kaus, also former New Republic editor, wrote a book about social inequality back in the late 70s or in the 80s that Christopher Lasch footnotes. So it's kind of fun. It was really funny to me when I was reading The Revolt of the Elites, and there's a citation of Mickey Kaus, who I'm watching on YouTube weekly now. So it's kind of like, this is history in today.
Yep.
Yeah, right. But anyway, so Robert Wright of formerly of Blogging Heads TV, of the Non-Zero newsletter. Boy, I'm promoting it. You could go sign up for his Substack. Anyway, he says that while in terms of votes, the youth vote probably won't be consequential in the election, like directly young people not voting for Biden, not consequential. In terms of organizing to get votes, young people's disaffection, yes, that will be consequential. So it will hurt the machine's ability to operate for the young, energetic activists not to be there to go out and canvass and organize for Biden.
And literally get people to the polling station or get them to fill out their absentee ballots or mail-in ballots. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that could be consequential. And also if you don't have that youthful activist group out there pushing for Biden, the whole campaign kind of, I think, loses energy in the process.
I mean, let me offer this.
Okay.
He might have lost that without the Gaza war. If the Gaza war had never happened, he might have lost it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I did, but it would have been quiet. It would have been
it would have been passive.
Yeah,
wouldn't have been like a reason for it.
Right. There would have been, but no one would have expressed it.
Yeah,
and the reason for it would be that the things that they wanted solved with Bernie weren't solved by the most progressive president in U.S. history. Yeah, right.
Right. No, I mean, LBJ was more progressive than FDR. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
And Nixon was even more progressive than LBJ.
Yep. That's true as well.
Yep.
We have clean water in Portland because of Richard Nixon. Yeah.
And also Richard Nixon was the anti-war candidate in 1968.
Right.
No, seriously.
I know.
No, we can't do the Orwellian. We can't go with the boomers' own Orwellian revision of history.
Nixon, why not? It's so easy, Chris.
No, we just can't accept any of these narratives. Zero.
Okay.
Not at all.
You know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, yes, but the limits that were imposed on the debate were so strict that he was an anti-war candidate the way that Obama was. Not really. He was for.
But he actually did end the war in Vietnam. He did.
Yeah.
He really did. And the Democrats would not have been able to. And why would the Democrats not have been able to? Because they wouldn't have been able to do the triangulation with China, and because that's really what ended it.
Right. Well, yeah.
Right?
So,
I mean,
yeah, I do think that. Look, let me just say one thing about. No, I'll tell you what. Why don't we pick this up in the parrot room? I'll say a couple things. One, I want to talk a little more about this ethno-religious explanation for politics.
Yeah, we can talk more about that, but let me just follow through the thought, which is that the Democrats' new narrative is that it's Christian fascism, right? And in other words, they kind of had that in 2016. They didn't have it as much in 2020. They definitely have it now. In other words, Trump, the explanation for Trump is Christian fascism. And I'm just
that was the explanation for George W. Bush too, right?
Sure. I mean, not in 2000 so much, but subsequently. I mean, they had a little bit of that. But so I just think that this kind of the third leg of the Reaganite coalition, the evangelical Christian vote, right? So if it was brain trusted by neoliberals and neoconservatives, it was affected by mobilizing the Christian right evangelical vote, which previously, like the other two elements, were part of the Democratic Party. So the evangelicals were in the New Deal coalition. The neoliberals and the neoconservatives are both coming from the Democrats over to the Republicans. So the new right is new because they're picking up new brain trust, new intellectuals, new policies, and a new voting bloc, right? And they also get the Dixiecrats, of course, but the Dixiecrats happens with Nixon. It doesn't happen with Reagan. That already had happened. But Reagan gets these others.
Right.
And so that third leg of the tripod, the Christian right, is more ambiguous, right? Because I don't think that Trump represents that. There have been other candidates that have represented that, like Ted Cruz in 2016, or Tim Scott, or Mike Pence in 2023, 2024. There have been other candidates for that. And I think that the devil's bargain, so to speak, that's made with the evangelicals and Trump is that, he needs them, they need him. And it's a marriage of convenience. And I also think that it actually shows how thin Christian evangelism is as a political force. In other words, that it's not some deeply rooted conservative obstacle to progress, right? That to satisfy it doesn't take very much, right? For the Republicans to win that vote and for that vote to feel satisfied doesn't take that much. Especially relative to the way the Democrats push things. In other words, we talked about this before, about Pat Robertson saying, well, we no longer want to put gays to death, we just don't want to be forced to bake them cupcakes. Right? In other words, if the Republicans are the candidate, that if their candidates are the ones who are like, we have to accept gay marriage, but we're not going to force you in your mom and pop bakery to bake cupcakes for gay people if you don't want to. That's Christian fascism. But I know with the you're in Portland, Oregon, so I know that people go into a coffee shop and someone says something rude to them and they say you're a fascist, right? So
not really. But
I mean, I know it doesn't take much for someone to be fascist, right? If you get cut off on the road, fascism, right?
My opinion about the gay wedding cake or the gay cupcakes or whatever is that.
Right.
It actually is a kind of a flip of a coin as to whose rights are going to take precedence in that moment. Do you have the right to free expression? Do they have the right to express themselves and practice their religion? Or actually, when and when I say religion, I mean the gay people's right to have a wedding ceremony. But whose right is going to win out because they're in conflict between two people.
So I'll go back to William F. Buckley. I'll go back to William F. Buckley and his debate at the Cambridge union with God, how am I forgetting his name?
I know. Was it CLR James? No.
It's not
Was it?
CLR James. It's I'm Not
No.
Your Negro. How am I forgetting his name?
We will definitely cut this. This will
Black gay author, big time. But anyway, his debate about like the civil rights movement and the LBJ reforms, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can't legislate morality.
James Baldwin, and let's just take
James
it again.
Baldwin, because I was like, it's not James Joyce. It's James.
No.
Because in my mind, James Baldwin could be James.
But look,
Joyce,
I said CLR James.
Yeah, CLR James, and I was like James Joyce. No, that's not it. James Baldwin.
Okay. Okay.
Baldwin.
Go back to William F. Buckley's. Just start from there. Say, let's go back to William F. Buckley's.
I go back to William F. Buckley and his debate with James Baldwin at the Cambridge Student Union, I think, in the mid-'60s. It's LBJ's reforms, and William F. Buckley is like, look, I'm against racism, but you can't legislate morality. You can't legislate attitudes. You can't force people not to be racist. I think that's true. In other words, I think that the idea that the government is going to say that a restaurant has to serve black people, I don't know about that one. Right? In other words, I feel like, is that the government's role? And anyway, is the civil rights movement, was the civil rights movement, what was that about? The Montgomery bus boycott or the sit-ins, at the lunch counters. Isn't that about civil social action? Isn't that about showing, look, you can desegregate the lunch counter? Is it about the state? Is it about the government? Do we need the government to do that?
Well, it was about the police not
arresting you for it.
Enforcing the law. Yeah.
Well, you know what the law was? The law was not, I don't think that the law was like it's illegal to sit at a segregated lunch counter. It was disturbing the peace. In other words, it was literally like
trespass.
Right? It's trespass because
the owner of the establishment has the right to ask you to leave. Period.
Right.
And if you
say no, I just feel like old style socialism. I go back to Eugene Debs.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He's like, look, racism is wrong, segregation is wrong. He refused to speak to segregated crowds. But he's like, is the goal of black people to be accepted by white people? Maybe not. And he said, like, look, when I look at these crackers, Eugene Debs was like, when I look at these white people, I'm like, black people shouldn't want their approval or their acceptance, right? Like, what are you talking about, And so, again, we've naturalized certain things that we shouldn't naturalize. Mm-hmm. And we have given to the state a role and an initiative that it should not have.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well, I'm a mixed mind. So the lunch counters in particular, that example is one where my anarchist anti-statism, which I can totally understand and reasonably, it sort of cracks a little. I'm not so sure. But I'm just going to cite
Adolf Reed. Adolf Reed is like, look, the state came in and formalized and legalized what was happening anyway, meaning society was being desegregated by capitalism. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there was like this cultural strife, but the idea that you actually needed the law and the police to fight racism, that is the succumbing of the movement to the state. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a basic point.
It's very difficult somehow I think it's going to be very difficult. That one more than the climate change one.
I mean, here's the difficulty.
For white, petit bourgeois, former Democrats to accept. I think that's,
because they want the police to beat up their racist uncle or something. I mean, what I would say is this, that, it comes down to a very basic thing, which is the law is not morality. How about that one? We talked about that a few weeks ago. You know, in other words, the right of the guilty to not be prosecuted, like people who are actually guilty not to be prosecuted, but also, do we want the law to satisfy our moral sentiments? In other words, do we want our moral sentiments to be officially instituted by law? Because that's what the right-wing people want. In other words, they think abortion is morally wrong, and they think the way you show that it's morally wrong is to have a law against it. They know people are still going to get abortions. They know it's still going to go back alley abortions and underground. They know it's still going to happen. They know the rich people are still going to get abortions. They just want the law to officially state that something is immoral. They know people are going to have gay sex. Like when gay sex was illegal, they knew it wasn't stopping people from having sex, but they thought that the law should officially declare the morality of the community. No. That's not what the law is for. The law is not to show moral approval or disapproval. No. That's where we have to go back to old style bourgeois. Like fewer laws are better, right? Less of a state is better, right? Less things for the police to arrest you for is better. Right. You know? The police not being there is better, right? Yeah. So the laws are on the books, but they're not being enforced because the police aren't everywhere to enforce them. That's better. Right. Yeah. It's not morality. Yeah. It's not morality. If we need the police to enforce morality, then we don't really have morality, do we?
No. And I agree. And when you have to have the police to enforce morality, civility, you're living in chaos.
Yeah, you're living in a social breakdown.
You want a good sign that things are breaking down, and you should probably get out of there. The cops are showing up. you know?
Absolutely, right. And so I feel like, look, the civil rights movement, they knew exactly what they were doing. You know, Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King, they knew what they were doing. They also knew what they were not doing. You know, they were, trying to bear moral witness. They were trying to influence popular opinion, but not just to force the state's hand. That's not what they were doing, right?
Right.
They were trying to affect social change. And the fact that became a kind of political, legal, state, bureaucratic, technocratic fix is tragic, right? Because then it's set up white people to resent. Right? White people are like, oh, I'm being forced to not be a racist. Like, they're going to punish me by law because of my thoughts and feelings. Right? It's a setup. Right? And the right wing is there to say it turned black people into wards of the state. And they're right about that.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to end it. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.